Hey life group leaders, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. This video is a recap of a training that we did that took a deeper dive into the idea of how do we make disciples within our life groups, and more specifically, how do we develop leaders. So those are kind of two sides of the same coin, but essentially we basically tried to take a big picture concept that we talked about back in March 2023, the big concept of multiplication and leadership development. We took a 30,000 foot view back in March, and what we are trying to do right now is actually take that to the ground level and give you some tools on how you can actually take your life group as it is and recruit, train, and motivate more leaders to be raised up, to be trained up, and to be sent out. And so this is not going to be an exhaustive video with all the content we could share, but we'll hopefully give you some tools and some language and verbiage that will help you be really intentional about investing in people in your life group, and then also specifically in leadership development. And so just to summarize a little bit of how we got to this point, let me kind of give you a quick recap on what we mean by multiplication, why we even talk about multiplication, and then we'll go into the weeds a little bit more on leadership development. So multiplication is just the idea that you're raising up somebody from within your group and sending them out to multiply the culture of your group with more people. That's all it is. And the why behind multiplication really comes from looking at the ministry of Jesus. We see that it was his model to take a few, to disciple a few who would then reach the many. So he would disciple a few who would reach the many. He had 12 disciples. He poured into all of them, but he poured into 3 on a little bit deeper level, Peter, James, and John. And then he sent them all out to go and reach the world. And so we see Jesus using the model of pouring into few to reach the many. And he wasn't necessarily opposed to crowds, but there were occasions where when Jesus would gather a crowd, he knew their motives, and he would say something harsh and it would send them away, because he knew that what people really needed more than anything was to be poured into relationally, rather than just to come be motivated, hear a sermon that they love, and then be sent out. And so here at Center Grove, we want to take the same approach. We are not opposed to having people come to church and having a full room. You know, you cannot disciple an empty chair. But our goal is not just to have a full church service. Our goal is to see the people who are coming to church and actually spending time pouring into them, investing in them. And the best way that that happens, and the best chance we have of making disciples, is within our life groups. So life groups, which you probably have experienced, and I know I've experienced this, is many people join a life group initially just because they want to make friends, they want to be in community, they know they can't do this life alone. And that is not a bad reason to join a life group, to be sure. That is a good reason to join a life group. But I want to help take people a little bit deeper, and I want to give people an opportunity to really be discipled in their life group, and not just actually come and make friends, but to be poured into, to have the opportunity to experience transformation. And that will only happen if we as leaders commit to this process of recruiting, training, and motivating people by entering into relationships, real relationships with those in our groups, and then recruiting them, training them, motivating them, sending them out. So that's what we're talking about. So the why behind multiplication is just, you look at the ministry of Jesus. Also, you see, really from the beginning of time, that one of the first mandates God gave Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and multiply. So we see the concept of multiplication woven into creation itself. And so that's a pretty compelling reason that we should try to aim for that. And one, just to kind of get rid of all the verbiage I'm throwing out here, I mean, the simplest way to remember it is, why do we multiply? Why do we develop leaders? Why do we make disciples? And I think the simplest way to put it would be to say, we make disciples and we develop leaders and we seek to multiply because the people that we invest into is the only investment we make that lasts eternally. That's daunting and amazing to think about. You know, we invest in our retirements, our 401ks, we invest in lots of things. We invest in our careers, and that's not a bad thing. But people, the people that you interact with, the people that you love, the people that you invest your time into, that's the only investment you make that is eternal. So we really want to take this job seriously. We have these life groups. It's a daunting task to lead them. everybody is on a different pace in terms of where your life group stage is at. Some of you guys maybe you feel like you're on life support. Some of you feel like you have a bunch of momentum and it's great. But regardless of where you're at on the stage spectrum, as far as a life group maturity goes, we all can take who God has given us right now in this moment and see if there's somebody who is able to be recruited, to be trained, and then to be motivated. So we want to develop leaders within our life groups and make disciples. You know, we've tried to set this process up for you so that you're not having to reinvent the wheel here as well. If you've, as you've worked through your vision guide, you saw in the first week of the vision guide at the beginning of the year, we talked through life group roles where you actually delegate responsibilities to people within your group. And that's the beginnings of this process. So it's all great to speak theoretically about multiplication and to talk about it in a grand way. But we really want to, when we get down to the weeds and you ask, how do you actually do that? I mean, the basic way you do that is through delegating responsibility within your life group, giving things away, training people to do some certain tasks. So that's really the point of having life group leader roles, from administrator, a prayer coordinator, an attendance keeper, and then someone who maybe is a little bit of a higher level and they are your missions coordinator, they organize your service projects, somebody who's your life sharing coordinator and they help organize your community events. And then of course you want to help develop a co-leader and who helps you lead the group, but then also an apprentice who can be trained up and then sent out. So that's what we talked about back in March. So that's the big picture view. Let's talk about what this actually means for us and how do we actually do this. And at our training where we talked about this, we did a little icebreaker where we basically had the tables talk about what are some things that you taught yourself, what are some things that you'd never try to teach yourself, and how did this whole process go? And what we found was when you ask the question, especially in this technological age, most everybody in the room had to use YouTube at some point to teach them how to do something. And that's awesome. I do the same thing. But there are some things in life that are probably over your head. There are some things that you probably won't be able to teach yourself to do. And the point I made in asking those questions was, if you think spiritually here, think about if we use YouTube to learn how to change our oil in our car, change our brakes, do something electrical. Most people don't want to try electrical things, but you can look it up on YouTube. If you think of the access we have to spiritual tools, to the Bible itself, to tools that help us understand the Bible and read the Bible, we have more access to these tools and resources than ever before in human history. We take for granted the fact that reading is so commonplace now, but for most of human history, literacy was for only those highest up in society. So this is a time in history where the Bible is more accessible than ever before. Tools to understanding the Bible are more accessible than ever before. And yet, I would argue we don't necessarily see this drastic increase of people who see these spiritual tools through technology and take them up and start becoming disciples and becoming like Jesus on their own, just kind of isolated. We don't see that happening because they have the access to the tools, but they're not taking them up, using them for their own spiritual growth, and then growing and becoming like Jesus. And the answer, or the question, is why? Why not? Why don't people use the tools that they have access to grow? And I would say this answer is probably oversimplified, but I would say the basic reason why people don't just take these tools and grow themselves and become like Jesus on their own is because discipleship is meant to happen in relationship. It is meant to happen in relationship. And we have got to be aware that just giving people knowledge, just giving people access to a tool doesn't mean that they're actually going to grow. They need a real relationship. They really need to be invested into. And the example I gave at the training was, if you think about, if you've done a project or skill and you used YouTube to teach you how does that compare to if you think about the first time your parent or a close friend taught you how to do something? You probably bonded with a parent, maybe a dad, maybe a mom. Maybe one of them was teaching you how to cook or how to do housework or how to, whatever, how to do some handy things. And there's probably some bonding moments with your parent learning how to do those things, or at least some memorable times, Well, YouTube doesn't give us that same sentimentality. It just doesn't. And discipleship is the same way. We have tools to help people grow, to help people be with Jesus and become like Jesus. But people won't take up these tools unless they are challenged and invited in a relational environment, in a relational setting. And so that's really our big overview here and what we're trying to argue for. And so let's talk a little bit more about how to actually do this within our life groups. We're going to talk about 3 phases, which I've already mentioned. There's 3 phases to making leaders in your life group, to making disciples. And I'm using those phrases interchangeably. I think that not every disciple is meant to lead a life group per se, but anybody who's going to be a leader must be discipled. So when I say relational discipleship, I'm also meaning leadership development. I think those things go hand in hand. And so I'll use those words interchangeably. So we're talking about leadership development and how this works. And there's 3 phases to this that I'm going to give you some tools and tips for. Those 3 phases are this. We are recruiting, we are training, and we're motivating. That's what you're constantly doing as a life group leader. If you feel like you don't know what to do or where to go next, ask yourself, okay, who am I recruiting? Who am I training? Who am I motivating? Who am I recruiting? Who am I training? Who am I motivating? We'll talk about each of those in succession. I'll try to be as brief as possible, and always I'm available to you to go deeper if we're over lunch or over coffee or at the church office or wherever you'd like to meet. Let's talk about recruiting. I've talked about this in other settings a lot. So you know the acronym that I use for identifying somebody who is potential leader. The acronym I use is FAT, F-A-T. You're looking for people who are faithful, available, and teachable. Faithful is the idea that they have proven character. Available is the idea that they're not overcommitted in other areas, which sometimes happens in a church environment. Somebody's serving in 5 different areas and they're overcommitted. So you got to be aware of if they're available. But you also, maybe most importantly, you want to be able to be sure that this person is teachable, that this person is willing to learn, that they actually want to learn. So that's the type of people you're looking to recruit. Now, what I've noticed in myself and in other people is to grow as a recruiter, you've got to have some self-awareness. And where you need to start in terms of self-awareness is asking yourself the question, am I a person who is low on the trust spectrum, like I don't easily trust people? Or am I somebody who trusts people very quickly and maybe even way too easily? So we're all one of those types of people. And if you are married to the opposite type of person. So you either really trust people really easily, believe the best in people, or you don't trust people very easily and you're a little skeptical and you really trust your intuition. So to grow as a recruiter, you got to know where you're at on that. If you're low on trust, people got to really earn it. You don't really trust people naturally. Then what you need to do is, the way you need to grow as a recruiter is you got to give people a chance. You really do got to give people a chance. Don't just write people off too quickly because they give you a bad feeling. I am a proponent of trusting your gut, trusting the Spirit, maybe giving you some discernment. So I'm not saying to violate your gut, but I am saying give people a chance. And the way you give people a chance, if you're kind of a low on trust person, is you just give them small roles that they can prove themselves in. And if they don't do well in those small things that you give them, then you don't have to continue to try to advance them up the leadership pipeline. So, the guy we worship, Jesus, said, he who's faithful with little will be faithful with more. So that's the approach you take if you are low on trust. And that's why we have a structure where there's group roles that start smaller and then they can actually build up. And so you give somebody something small. If they do it well and they do it humbly, then you progress them on to the next step. If you are high on trust, if you're somebody who believes in people, you've never believed the worst in anybody, maybe that's not you, but maybe you just trust people pretty easily. If that's you need to be sure if you want to grow as a recruiter, you cannot skip steps. So you will be, you might have the temptation to, somebody comes to your group for the first time, they're charismatic, they're participatory, you connect well with them, you have chemistry with them. And if you're high on trust, the first time you meet somebody and they kind of give you that just a great first impression, then you might just try to jump the gun and say, hey, you seem to really have some skills here, have some competence here, we've connected well, would you consider being part of this training process to become a leader? Well, you don't want to do that too soon, so don't skip steps. Give people some time, get to know some people, and see if they're faithful, if their character really is high. And so don't skip steps if you're the high trust person. And so you've got to be aware of where you're at so you can grow as a recruiter. But we all need to be constantly scanning the room. Who is faithful, available, and teachable that I could recruit and invite into a relationship where I could pour into them and they could be developed into a leader. So having said that, there is a diagnostic on the notes that I gave you that will help you actually determine if somebody is faithful, available, and teachable. And so there's a bunch of questions you could ask that I gave on the notes that are in an email that I'll send to you. And on that diagnostic, there's really two questions that I just want to point out. I'm not going to read them all to you. But what you're really looking for when you're recruiting somebody is you're asking yourself, are there any signs of pride? First of all, pride is we all have, of course, a measure of pride in that's the essence of sin is pride, putting me first, exalting myself. But what I mean by pride is, we are pretty good at sniffing out somebody who has an agenda. Sometimes somebody wants to infiltrate a life group, have an agenda, kind of get some power because they want to feed their own ego. And so the reason you take some steps to help develop them is to just give them time to test that, to see if that's true. So are there any signs of pride? You want to be looking for that. And you could talk on and on about that, but I'm not going to waste too much time on that. Another thing that I like to see when I'm recruiting somebody is there a healthy sense of nervousness about stepping into a leadership role? I actually want to see that. I want to see somebody who's a little bit nervous, because that means they don't have all the answers. That means they're probably going to be more teachable. And so I like that. I really like that. So if you're recruiting somebody and they're like, oh yeah, this is nothing, I've done this before, I'm going to crush it. That would give me a little bit of a pause. That would give me a pause. But if somebody's like, you know what, I'm nervous about this, but I feel like God is really tugging at me to step up, I like that. I like to see a little bit of nervousness. So that's how you identify somebody to recruit. And then very quickly, I'm moving through these notes that you have access to. So if you're driving or something, please don't look at the notes, look at them later. But once you actually recruit somebody, then you've got to know how you're going to share the why. You've got to know what the training process is going to be like so that you can share that with them. And then you also have to just ask them. You have to ask them. Don't just assume that they know what you're asking them to do. You have to actually make the ask. So first, you got to know a good why. If you're recruiting somebody in your life group to be developed into a leader, don't just say, Seth told me we need more life groups, so would you consider doing this? That might be true, but that is not necessarily a compelling reason to lead a life group. What is a compelling reason to lead a life group is to say, we believe that transformation happens in relationships, and shepherding a life group is not always easy. It actually can be taxing and exhausting, but it's so fulfilling to have the chance to lead people and give them a chance to walk closer with Jesus. That's more compelling. And so you share that, and I've given you some verbiage on your notes to help understand the why that you can share with somebody. That is going to be key. You've got to be clear on it so that you can communicate it well. There are some ideas on what you can share in terms of the why. I'm not trying to give you like a script so that you can be like a Center Grove mantra robot, because I want you to be yourself. But I did give you some verbiage there about understanding the why when you recruit somebody. Then you actually got to just ask them plainly what you're asking them to do. So you could just say, hey, John, I would love for you to consider being a part of a training process to become a leader. Would you be interested in that? And I can explain the process to you. If they say yes, then you just tell them what the process is. You say, okay, well, we're going to meet every other week before our life group, and I'm going to make sure that you have the knowledge, the experiences, and I'm going to give you some feedback so that we can help prepare you for this. And so you set that time up where you actually spend time with the person that you're going to invest into. And we're going to talk about that in the next section on training. But one thing, quick plug here, if you are maybe a little bit lost on how you actually when you're sitting one-on-one with somebody, what do you go over with them? What do you actually do? Well, the reason we launched discipleship mentoring groups, DMGs, is because we wanted to give life groups a vehicle for discipleship that you could use for this very reason, to relationally pour into those in your group. So if you have questions about DMGs, come talk to me. I've kind of explained it in other environments. I'm not going to over-explain it here. But what I would love to see happen is I would love to see, this is going to take some time, but I would love to see every life group have their life group and then have DMGs within their life group. So you have your co-ed life group probably that you're not going to be able to say everything you could say in terms of confessing sin and having people hold you accountable, because the room is mixed and there's a whole host of reasons why you can't be 100% transparent all the time in that setting. But in a DMG, It's a gender specific group where the goal of that is where you get more real, you get more intentional, and you have a clearer process and a clearer structure. And so I'd love to help you launch some DMGs within your life group if you are interested. But that's a great vehicle for actually training somebody. Let's talk about training. So we talked about recruiting, we went in on that. Now let's talk about what the training process actually looks like. So when you're training somebody, you need people to be trained well. People need three things. People need knowledge, they need experiences, and they need coaching. They need knowledge, experiences, and coaching. Just think about this. This is true in your own life. Okay, think about a job that you were onboarded for, or even a church volunteer position maybe that you were onboarded to do. If you've probably had an experience where somebody sat you in a room in front of a TV and just laid out all the policies and procedures, right? They just dumped information on you. That probably didn't prepare you well, okay? That's when somebody only receives knowledge. Knowledge alone is not enough. Now, people also need experiences. Some of you have started jobs before and they just like threw you out on the floor and gave you no information at all. And you just had to figure it out. It's kind of trial by fire. And sometimes you figure it out. Sometimes it's a disaster. So that would be like giving somebody an experience without giving somebody knowledge. That would be like recruiting somebody in your life group to be trained to be a leader. And before you tell them anything, you tell them to lead the life group that they're in. So you wouldn't do that. You would give them knowledge, and then you would give them experiences. So you pour into them with some knowledge through some one-on-one time, and then you give them an experience. You say, okay, on this day, I want you to facilitate the life group discussion, and I'll watch you. And so you need knowledge and experiences. And then the last thing you need is coaching. Okay, so this is something we all need more of that we don't have enough of. But coaching is the idea of feedback. You actually are watching them learn, you're watching them live out an experience that you've given them, and then you're giving them feedback on that experience. You're really giving them something to grow in, and you're encouraging them in that. The one example I use to talk about coaching is, let me back up. Coaching is basically a combination of invitation and challenge, okay? So all of us, especially if you're a people pleaser, you might be overly encouraging and you never really want to give somebody some feedback that could be interpreted as criticism. If you're like black and white, hard truth person, maybe you are very short on encouragement and you just give people challenges. Okay, you need both. You need invitations and you need challenges. So if you think about the example that we find in Matthew chapter 16, this awesome example where Jesus takes his disciples to a place called Caesarea Philippi. This is a place of massive pagan worship. And Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And Peter gets it right. He says, you are the Messiah. And Jesus commends Peter. He says, well done. You answered rightly. This has been revealed to you by God, and you're going to be used mightily to lead this church that is getting built. And so Jesus invites Peter into this closer type of relationship. He actually says, Peter, you're right. Good job. You're going to be used in a big way in the kingdom of God. That's what he says. But then what's awesome, maybe it's not awesome, but it's funny. In the very next section, Jesus then explains to the disciples, okay, you said I'm the Messiah. You are right. This is what it means for me to be the Messiah. That means I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees. I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise again. And then Peter hears that and tries to rebuke Jesus. He says, Jesus, you can't say that. That can't be. And then what Jesus does is he rebukes Peter and says, hey, get behind me, Satan. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And so Jesus does both. Invites Peter into closer relationship. Peter, great job. You answered rightly. You're going to be used by God. But then Peter does something wrong, and Jesus challenges him. He doesn't kick him to the curb. He doesn't say, I'm done with you, Peter. Goodness, you are just done. No, he actually he rebukes Peter in love, and then he brings him in close. So he invites him in and he challenges him. And that's what coaching is. It's invitation and it's challenge. That's what it is. So to train somebody, they need knowledge, they need experiences, and they need coaching. Let me just kind of back up just a little bit and hopefully put your mind at ease. When it comes to like knowledge, what knowledge do you actually give somebody? Well, we've tried to give you language as a life group leader that is transferable to others. So the idea that your groups are aiming at gospel, community, and mission, those are 3 areas that you actually would train leaders in. You help them become gospel-centered and understand that more deeply. You help them become understanding of what community is, life-sharing, burden-bearing, bread-breaking. You help them understand what mission is and what that looks like in the life of an individual and a life group leader. So you definitely train them in those 3 things. But one thing I would also highly, highly encourage you to do is you don't assume everybody in your life group, even those you are training, have a vibrant time alone with God. The first thing you probably should teach somebody to do is how to meet with Jesus, which again, this is the beauty of a DMG, is in a DMG, we give you a Bible reading tool called Reading and Reflecting. It's a very simple tool, and that's how you spend time with God, is through the use of this tool. So if you are training somebody, you need to first and foremost ask them, so what is your time alone with God like? If it's lackluster, then you help give them some knowledge and some tools to develop that in a deeper way. But everybody needs to have time alone with God, and that's the first thing that you train them in. And also, one more aside is my goal, because you guys have day jobs, and I realize that. So you're not, just full of time to read a bunch of books and to feel and to have all this information. But what I'd like to do, my goal this summer, is to film a series of short videos. I say short, but we'll see. Film a series of videos that are going to be training tools that will be refreshers for you, but also will be tools that you could use if you're training somebody in your life group. They need that relationship with you, but to take the burden of you to have all this knowledge just ready, accessible in the top of your head, then there'll be some videos that you guys could watch together where I'll just walk through gospel, community, and mission and some other things. And then you can still have that relationship with these people you're training. Then use those videos as some knowledge that you talk about deeper and that you go into deeper. And then it makes it easier on you, hopefully. So that's my goal, is to provide that for you over the summer and have them ready by August. So knowledge, experiences, and coaching. That's how you train an apprentice. And then the last part of recruiting, training, or of the leadership development, we have recruiting, we have training. Last thing is we have motivating. We want to motivate people. And this will require you to look at your notes. I am not tech savvy, so I don't know how to put this on the screen. So I will hold up the notes themselves to you as I'm talking. I'm not going to hold this up the whole time. But when it comes to motivating, what do we mean by motivating? Because it seems like very similar to training. Well, motivating is simply knowing where somebody is on the growth process and encouraging them onto their next step. And so on this page of your notes, page 6, I have this cycle that I've just held up to you. And I've used this in a sermon before, but I'm very confident you probably don't remember that, because I don't expect you to just soak all that in. And it was a long time ago. But this process of growth is basically you start up here with unconscious incompetence. So when you first start pouring into somebody, or you think about the first time you started something, you were not good at something and you didn't even really know it. It's kind of like, my kids are toddlers. They might think that they probably think they're a little bit more athletic than they come off to be. They have an unconscious incompetence. Or to pick on myself, you may have had this experience where you get filmed doing something, like especially playing a sport, like maybe you get filmed running. Like me, I'm a terrible runner. I'm slow and I'm gangly. And when you're running though, you feel like you're going pretty fast. You feel like you're moving. And then you watch a video of yourself and you're like, oh my goodness, do I really look like that? That is goofy. So it's like, okay, well, I could use a coach to come alongside me and teach me, okay, what's better running form? How can I clean this up? But if I don't have somebody motivating me, seeing where I'm at, and then speaking into me, then I might never get better. So that's where people start, is in an unconscious incompetence. And then they move towards a conscious incompetence, meaning as they spend time with you, they realize, okay, I'm really not as good at meeting with God as I need to be. And then they're aware that they have a need, that they have a lack. And that's a good place to be. You can keep coaching them. And the way you motivate somebody is you see where they're at and you keep pushing them on, keep giving them feedback, keep lovingly sharing tools and resources and all of that. Once they're in conscious incompetence, meaning they're aware that they're no good, then they move on to conscious competence, meaning they start getting better and they're aware that they're getting better. And this is actually where pride can enter into somebody's life, is when they're getting better at something and they are aware of it. And so that's where you keep telling them, as a life group leader, you've got to depend on Jesus, even though you're getting good, even though you don't need to prepare as long as you used to. When your competency goes up, oftentimes your dependence on God goes down. And so you need to make sure you're continually leaning into Jesus. And that's how you help motivate them when they're in the season of conscious competence. And then over time, as life happens to them, as humility starts taking over, many of you are in this fourth stage that I'll mention, and that is an unconscious competence, meaning you are doing well and you're good at something, but you're not always thinking about it. You're not always thinking about how good you are at leading the life group. You're not filling yourself up with pride over it, but it just kind of becomes a part of who you are, and it's more natural. And that's where you're taking somebody. And that's how you motivate them, is you see where they're at and you help them move on to the next step. And so you see here that the key ingredient, which I've said so many times already, is the key ingredient to leadership development is relationships. We got to be in relationships with people. Kind of like the example of YouTube. You can learn stuff from YouTube, but it's better to learn it from somebody else because it's more sentimental. You form a connection with that person, and it overall just goes better. The last thing we talked about is just a fun little mental exercise. You know, if you think about, I don't have the number of life group leaders off the top of my head, but usually at the trainings we have between like 30 and 40 of the life group leaders show up. And so if you think about, if 30 life group leaders are in the room and 30 of them commit to discipling, let's just say one person. I said 2 at the training and did some incorrect math because I'm a pastor, so I'm going to try to correct that now. So let's say 30 life group leaders commit to discipling one person. This is an idealistic exercise. I know that there's obstacles along the way here, but let's just say that one person, you choose to disciple one person in the span of a year, and you give them a process that's reproducible and simple, and then the one person you disciple chooses to disciple one person the next year, and so on. And if that were to keep happening and multiplication kept happening on that individual level, just with starting with 30 people discipling one, in 7 years there'd be 1,920 disciple makers that flowed out of this church, which is double our current church attendance. So you can see the potential of committing to relational discipleship and what that could actually lead to. Is it just doubles and doubles and doubles. And again, I know life happens. That's more of an idealistic exercise. But my point is we can spend a lot of time doing things that we think are effective, but are not as effective as relational discipleship. And that's really why I've hit this hammer or hit this nail so many times, because it is that big of an opportunity. So the last thing I'll say is I am always here to help if I can do anything for you. I know that this is an intimidating task for many of us, and many of you guys are, your life groups are in different stages. And so I hope you know by now and trust me that I'm aware of that and can definitely work with you wherever you're at. But I want to help you be a disciple maker within your life groups. And so please let me know if there's any questions you have or if you need any resources at all. This is filmed in May of 2023. And so if you are a group that has a varied summer schedule, please send that to me as soon as you know what your summer schedule will be like. That way we don't recommend your group to somebody who is asking about a group and then send them to either your room or send them to an event or something, and then you guys end up not being there, because that can obviously really be hard for somebody to connect. If they try to connect and then they have a failed first attempt, it can really be discouraging. So it helps us to know so that we can best help people find your group if they are asking for it. Also, if you have questions about discipleship mentoring groups, come talk to me. We have tools. We have a Blue Participants Guide booklet that we gave out at the training, and we have a bunch of copies of the Reading and Reflecting Bible Reading Tool. I'd be glad to help train you in that and help show you how to actually implement that within your life group. But please let me know if there's anything like that you need from me. And as always, I've got your back. Our next training is going to be August 2023. It's going to be a church-wide training. We'd love for all of you guys to be there, because that's going to be that's going to include some vision from Dr. Quartz and a church-wide element. And then we'll break out into our section as life group leaders and talk a little bit more about the upcoming months. So thank you for all you do. I've always got your back if I can do anything for you. and please let me know.